According to the New York Times, at least 108 million people have been killed in wars in the 20th century. The First World War started in Europe and lasted more than 4 years from 1914 to 1918, with 7 million civilians and 10 million military personnel losing their lives. The Second World War lasted for 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, with deaths ranging from 50 million to more than 80 million. Both of these wars were catastrophic, but could it happen again? That's what we'll find out in this episode of the Infographic Show. What are the chances of World War III? Wars can break out for a number of reasons. World War I arguably started when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated on June 28, 1914. This was the immediate cause, but there were a series of events which triggered the 4-year-long war. And though there were a number of incidents that led to World War II, the European emergence of the conflict came about on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, which led Britain and France to declare war on Hitler's Nazi state in retaliation. A third world war could come about through a US-Russia dispute, or possibly US-China. And of course, North Korea, which has been the hot topic in the press right now after President Trump's historic meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Hopefully that's made it less likely that a war with North Korea will happen anytime soon. A recent New York Post article featured the words of Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said, "The understanding that a third world war could be the end of civilization should restrain us from taking extreme steps on the international arena that are highly dangerous for modern civilization." This was during his annual televised call-in show where he fields questions from the public. When you mention the words World War III, you can't help but think of nuclear weapons, as it's likely a third world war would be a nuclear one. Before we explore how a nuclear war might play out, let's first take a brief look back at the history of nuclear weapons development. The world's first nuclear weapons explosion was on July 16, 1945, in New Mexico, when the United States tested its first nuclear bomb. It was only 3 weeks later, on August 6, 1945, that the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It killed or wounded nearly 130,000 people, and 3 days later, the United States bombed Nagasaki, which killed 74,000 people and injured another 75,000. These two events marked the end of World War II. Because this was back at the beginning of nuclear weapons development, and with only one side having nuclear capability, there was no retaliation. Following the Second World War, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain conducted more nuclear weapons tests, and in 1958, nearly 10,000 scientists presented to United Nations Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld a petition that begged, "We deem it imperative that immediate action be taken to effect an international agreement to stop testing of all nuclear weapons." Throughout the 1960s and 70s, as more development took place, treaties were signed to promote disarmament, but more and more countries developed nuclear weapons. Today they are believed to be around 16,300 nuclear weapons spread between 9 countries. They are the United States, Russia, the UK, France, China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Russia and the US share 93% of all nuclear warheads out there, but they have been asked to reduce the number of weapons under the START Treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. All these weapons make the prospect of a third world war very different to the First and Second World Wars. So assuming World War III did kick off, and it was nuclear, what would it look like? HuffPost has launched HuffPost Apocalypse, a project that aims to investigate what an apocalypse would mean for humanity, and to support this, have been doing their own research and analysis into what the effects of a nuclear war might be. In a recent article, they proposed 2 scenarios. The first, a global nuclear war centered on a US and Russia conflict. In this scenario, at between 1,800 and 3,000 large warheads would be fired at nuclear weapon launch sites, ports, major industry command centers, power stations, and densely populated areas. The other potential area of tension that could spark a conflict is between India and Pakistan. This scenario would be on a much smaller scale, with around 100 smaller nuclear weapons being used out of stockpiles of around 200, with strikes on densely populated supercities such as Delhi and Karachi. But it's possible that it could lead to a larger conflict with other countries becoming involved. What would the fallout be? When these bombs are dropped, there would be intense nuclear radiation and a blinding flash brighter than the sun, a fierce fireball, and a massive blast wave that would kill thousands. With so many casualties, aid organizations would be overwhelmed and unable to help all of the injured, meaning many would be left to fend for themselves with severe injuries including burns, broken bones, and deep cuts from flying debris. And the long-term results would be even more catastrophic. With so many fires burning, the skies would be filled with smoke clouds similar to a large volcanic eruption. These would block out the sun, which would cause the atmosphere and Earth to cool, resulting in what's known as a nuclear winter. The latest climate models suggest that the use of a few tens to 100 of the smaller nuclear weapons in the India-Pakistan scenario would cause severe frosts, drought, and famine, which would last up to 10 years and stretch across the entire northern hemisphere. In the bigger America-Russia scenario, there would be a long-lasting cold period with a global reach. It would go on for a decade or more and could be likened to a mini ice age. Talk of a third world war has been going on for years, much of the fear driven by the Cold War tensions between Russia and America, which lasted from 1947 to 1991. These days, there are still concerns that these two nations could come to blows, but the rise in power of China and also the nuclear development program in North Korea has meant new danger areas are present.
You're jolted awake by the sound of blaring sirens, and in a daze you look around the dimly lit room. Through the curtains comes a blood-red glow. You slowly walk toward the window and pull back the curtains. An intense light from outside is blinding. You bring your arm up to your face to shield your eyes. As you squint to bring the world into focus, you see something looming in the distance. A mushroom cloud the size of a mountain rises from the ground. It's finally happened. World War III has begun, and you most likely won't survive it. You run across the room and grab your cell phone. It's dead. The EMP blast from the nuke has wiped out all electronics and microchips in the surrounding area. You run to grab the survival kit you built based on one of your favorite infographics show videos. It has everything you need to survive a doomsday scenario. You take out the crank radio and you turn it. Over the static comes a crackling voice. The announcer confirms what you've been afraid of this whole time. The voice on the radio, it fades in and out. You can only make out pieces of the announcement, but it's clear what's happening. The world has broken out into all-out war. This is nothing like past world wars with soldiers, tanks, and planes. No, this war is all about nukes, cyber hackers, and space. The voice on the radio relays which cities have been hit. It started with Washington, D.C., then Hong Kong. Retaliation from the Chinese took out Los Angeles, then the nukes were launched at Moscow. The Middle East in its plumes of fiery oil and gas. Mainland Europe is at war with Britain. Almost every major city in the world has been hit. Billions of lives have been lost instantly. But what about you and the others who were lucky enough to survive the initial blasts? Could you survive World War III? Probably not, but let's see what might be in store for you. As you prepare to leave your house and seek shelter in more rural areas, you hear the radio announcer trying to determine how the carnage started. It seems that no one's quite sure who launched first or who the aggressor was. Before World War III broke out, there were some ominous conflicts brewing. You hear a shuffling of papers as the broadcaster organizes his notes. He, like everyone else left on Earth, is trying to make sense of what's happening. The announcer begins his rundown of what sparked World War III and the end of the world as you know it. This all could have been avoided if the United States and Iran maintained diplomatic relations instead of blowing up each other's military assets, he says. Or maybe it all started with North Korea threatening the United States over and over again. Then someone with a happy trigger finger launched the first nuke. My best guess, continues the broadcaster, was that China had finally caught up to the military strength of the US, and differences in ideology led to a conflict that may very well end up eradicating all of humanity. You grab your survival kit, thank you to the infographic show for helping you to prepare for a doomsday scenario, and you walk out of your house. Planes have fallen out of the sky and lay in fiery wrecks around your neighborhood. The EMP blasts from the nukes fried their controls and caused many to fall from the sky. You start walking down the street. You know the radiation from the nuclear explosion is enough to cause third-degree burns even if you're miles away. Not to mention even small doses of radiation can cause mutations in your DNA, which can lead to cancer and other diseases. Just by being within eyesight of the nuclear explosion of World War III means you might not survive. Then suddenly something enters the atmosphere causing a sonic boom. You look up and shield your eyes as a fireball careens toward the ground. The object smashes into your house, causing it to ignite in a fiery explosion. You run back to see what happened. Where your house once stood, there is now a large crater. On one of the metal shards that's sticking out of the earth, you see some writing. You kick the debris off to clear the dirt. The acronym NASA adorns the metal plate. The fireball that fell from the sky and destroyed your house was a satellite. This is a new type of warfare, you think, the warfare of space. You look up into the sky and see flashes of light beyond the atmosphere. World War III has gone beyond the terrestrial world and now includes the cosmos. Crude rockets are launched to take control of the International Space Station. It's not a military asset per se, but it offers a strategic advantage. From the ISS, rockets and other spacecraft can be refueled. Satellites can be manipulated, and data using onboard sensors and cameras can be relayed to the military. World War III has now weaponized space. Outer space is not the only battleground that's not on the planet's surface. Hackers have turned cyberspace into a war zone as well. They've taken control of military assets on both sides of the war. These hackers might be working for the opposition or just for themselves. Either way, they've hacked into satellite guidance systems and military computers. And this war is not led just by the generals of the military, but by the tech geeks who command the world of code as well. World War III is a physical war and a cyber war. Since your coding skills are not up to par, you figure it's best to get away from populated areas and the technology that's associated with them. You never know when a hacker will take over one of the military's autonomous robots or drones and send it after you. There's no way I'm going to survive this, you think, as you head toward the city limits. As you run toward the tree line on the outskirts of town, you begin to cough. There's smoke coming out of the forest. What fresh hell is this, you think? You head for higher ground to survey the area that used to be a protected state park. You climb the ladder of a water tower and take out the binoculars from your survival kit. Where would I be without all the survival tips from the infographic show, you think? Probably already dead. From the water tower, you see that the forest is ablaze. Smoke pours out of the treetops and into the air. When the nuke went off, the residual heat ignited part of the forest, and now the uncontrollable blaze is burning away every tree in its path. This is all happening around the world. It's at this point you realize you are in big trouble. Yeah, you were in trouble before, but now you see what the future holds. Winter is coming, and it's not the Game of Thrones version. The winter that's coming for you is nuclear winter. There's no way you're gonna make it through this alive. The weapon of choice for World War III is the nuke. Unfortunately for all of humanity, nuclear explosions have long-term effects that are more widespread than just the initial explosion. You leave the urban area that was once home and head for the rural lands away from any major hub of civilization. You figure that the safest place to be during World War III is where there is little technology and even fewer people. You find an abandoned coal mine that's been drilled into a mountain. The thick rock walls provide you some protection from radiation and keeps you shielded from the natural elements. Your new cave home keeps you alive for a little while longer, but how much longer will you be able to survive with nuclear winter on the horizon? As you step out of your cave in the middle of the afternoon, the first thing you notice is that it's dark. The smoke, soot, and debris that's been flung up into the atmosphere by the nuclear explosions is suspended in the air. The superheated air around where the bombs went off forced particles from the surface to rise. The debris in the atmosphere has blocked out the sun. Earth's temperature has begun to cool. You're in the early stages of nuclear winter. In the days that follow the beginning of World War III, soot and smoke from the smoldering remains of cities enters the atmosphere. The nuclear blasts melt everything from plastics to metal and release harmful chemicals into the air. This not only began blocking out the sun, but vast amounts of carcinogens and other chemicals are swept across the planet by wind. No one's safe from the nuclear fallout. Next came the firestorms. The cities where nuclear devices exploded are on fire. The surrounding towns are on fire, the forests are on fire. These fires never get a chance to burn out before the wind sweeps them across the planet. In the United States, the fires in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle are swept across the Great Plains, causing the entire Midwest to burn. In Russia, even with its freezing temperatures, the forests are ablaze. Anything that could catch fire did catch fire. No one's safe from the flames of the nuclear holocaust. And with those flames, smoke and dust rise into the atmosphere, ensuring that sunlight won't shine on Earth for weeks. And after weeks of no sunlight, it starts to snow. It isn't white snow like you played in as a child, but black snow. What falls from the sky is all the soot and debris from the fires that are burning the planet. The charred black snow covers the ground. At least the sun's back, you think. Unfortunately, it's too late. The lack of sunlight has caused the Earth's temperature to drop and nuclear winter to begin. You lived through nuclear bombs exploding, you lived through fires engulfing the planet, you lived through black snow falling from the sky, but now that nuclear winter has started, you most certainly won't live to see the return of summer. The days go by and World War III is slowed down, not because there's a clear victor, but because everyone is a loser. The human species has lost. You are one of the few remaining individuals of a now endangered species. After the black snow begins to fall, the temperature declines by 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Killer frosts and sub-freezing temperatures wipe out much of the remaining plant and animal life on Earth. You struggle to find anything to eat and unpolluted water to drink. You subsist entirely off of old army rations you found at an abandoned military base. Even in the extremely cold temperature, your body burns from the inside. There's no escaping the radiation that was ejected into the air from the hundreds of nuclear explosions. Like you, plants and animals around the world are suffering from burns and harmful mutations caused by the radiation. Evolution cannot keep up with the rapidly cooling planet and changing environments. Almost all life on Earth goes extinct. You sit in the mouth of your cave and look out at the once smoldering, now freezing world created by World War III. Some humans who reached fallout shelters will survive longer than you. It'll be years before all the soot and dust particles descend from the atmosphere. It will be decades before the radiation from nuclear fallout decreases to livable levels. It'll be centuries before life is able to bounce back from the devastation World War III has caused to this planet Earth. And it'll be millennia before the climate and ecosystems in heavily hit areas return to stability. You will not survive World War III. If you're able to make it through a nuclear attack without being incinerated in the initial blast, avoid being poisoned by the radioactive fallout, or getting killed by collateral damage, then you'll be one of the lucky few. But like most life on the planet, you'll not be able to survive the nuclear winter that follows World War III. There will be no winners in this type of war. On a positive note, life on Earth will eventually bounce back. Humans are currently messing up the planet in many ways, and someday we might be our own demise. But planet Earth will carry on. Thousands of years after the end of World War III, when nuclear winter has subsided and the climate patterns become stable under new norms, life will evolve to thrive in a post-human, post-World War III world. Who knows what life will be capable of after World War III eliminates all humans on the planet? It's too bad you won't be around to see it. In The Hunt for Red October, a 1990 film based off a 1984 book by the same name, the entire Soviet fleet mobilizes to hunt down a renegade submarine on the way to defect to the United States. In command of the most advanced submarine in the world and armed with a stealth electromagnetic drive that made it invisible to sonar, Soviet Captain Marko Ramius sets course for America with the Soviet fleet hot in pursuit. What follows is a tense standoff between the Soviet and American fleets as the U.S. suspects the incoming Soviet fleet may be the spearhead of a surprise attack in what will become World War III. The Hunt for Red October may have been a spy and political thriller based on fantasy, but unbeknownst to the West, an eerily similar situation played out behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union just 9 years before the release of the novel. On November 9, 1975, while the Soviet Union celebrated the 58th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, a plot was being set in motion that nearly drove the world to the brink of World War III. That day, the Soviet state-of-the-art destroyer Starosevoy docked in the port city of Riga, capital of the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. The ship had been open to public tours all day, and now with the evening festivities in full swing, half of its crew had been excused for shore leave in order to join the celebrations. Left aboard the ship was the ship's Zampolit, or political officer, Captain 3rd Rank Valery Mikhailovich Sablin. As the ship's political officer, Sablin was second only to the captain himself, and his responsibilities were to see the general welfare of the crew, as well as overseeing their political education. This made Sablin well liked by most of the crew. When they had problems back home, he was the man they went to see. And because his chain of command was completely outside of that of the regular Soviet navies, there was little fear of repercussions if they brought private complaints to him. His position gave him regular access to the crew, while most of the rest of the Soviet officers maintained a distance from the regular enlisted men. This not only made Sablin popular, but gave him a great deal of influence amongst the crew. And as the ship's official political officer, he was largely in charge of shaping the political ideology of each and every man aboard the Starosevoy. The son of a Soviet colonel, Sablin had grown up in the Soviet upper class, a concept which Soviet-style communism was supposed to do away with. But Stalin's implementation of true communism had always fallen well short of the mark. Yet despite his privileged upbringing, Sablin displayed a genuine care for the rest of the crew, which was mostly made up of conscripts from poor farming villages or the lower class living in the cities. These were exactly the people that Soviet policies had exploited and oppressed, Stalin having completely perverted Lenin's original dream of a classless society built on equality. Now most of them were forced to serve military terms in the Soviet military, where they received little pay, poor food, and terrible accommodations. Yet unlike most political officers, Sablin spent the twice-weekly mandatory political lessons the crew were forced to endure actually listening to the men. When they brought up complaints, instead of towing the party line and parroting propaganda, Sablin agreed with the men. This made him well-liked and trusted by the majority of the crew, to the point that they would bring deeply personal problems to him directly, such as conflicts with other crew members or troubles back home with a girlfriend, wife, or parents. While the Starosevoy was a state-of-the-art destroyer with impressive anti-air and anti-submarine capabilities, its crew performed less impressively than its equipment. An article in the Soviet military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda had been critical of the Starosevoy, naming it in an article that claimed its crew was poorly disciplined. It also said that many comrades were lapsing on the ethical front and taking up liberal positions in the fight for purity of the heart. It went on to name several officers, to include Sablin, as being unable to explain why the ship's crew crew suffered so many problems and ended with a call for the ship to do better and for its crew to carry their party cards next to their hearts. What all this meant in non-propaganda terms was that the ship suffered from serious morale problems, and while its weapons and other systems were cutting-edge and highly sophisticated, its crew was treated poorly and thus performed just as poorly. Meanwhile, it was Sablin's job to try to keep up morale while educating the men on the virtues of Soviet-style communism. On that November 9, 1975, the many problems of the Starosavoy would come to light as political officer Sablin held a secret meeting with the remaining crew. The system had failed them, he said. Corrupt party officials had used their power to enrich themselves, and the grand revolution of so many years ago had all been for naught. The czars may have been overthrown, but dictators had taken their place, and Lenin's dream of equality had been corrupted. But today they could act to set things right. They could take advantage of the patriotic zeal spurred on by the Revolution Day celebrations and broadcast a message to the people directly, calling them to rise up against the corrupt government that oppressed them. Sablin proposed that the crew mutiny and seize the ship, sailing it out of the Bay of Riga to Leningrad through the Neva River, where they would moor alongside the museum ship Aurora, which was a symbol of the Russian Revolution. There, just outside of Leningrad, Sablin would broadcast a revolutionary message directly to the people, saying publicly what he believed the Soviet people were too afraid to say themselves. Socialism and the motherland were in danger, threatened by corrupt party officials who sought only to enrich themselves. The plan was risky. The moment the Soviet Navy detected the Starosavoy leaving Soviet waters, it would fear that the ship was trying to defect to the west and give chase. It might even attack the ship directly, and if the crew were caught, they would no doubt be imprisoned and likely executed. Sablin then proposed a vote amongst the senior officials left on the ship, with 8 officers in favor and 7 against it. The 7 who were against the mutiny were locked in a compartment below the deck, and the captain was lured to a separate compartment by Sablin, claiming that drunk officers needed to be disciplined, only to be locked in as well. The remaining crew needed to be won over now, and with a fiery speech he won the crew's support, exciting them with the talk of revolution and a future full of new possibilities. Any who did not wish to join in the revolution were locked away without violence, but unbeknownst to Sablin and the rest of the crew, one of the officers who had voted in favor of the mutiny had secretly snuck away. He ran across the docks to a guard post and warned the soldier there that the crew of the Starosavoy was planning to mutiny and sail the ship out of port, but the soldier on duty refused to believe the officer, believing him to be drunk from the festivities. Though the original plan had called for the Starosavoy to set sail in the morning with the rest of the fleet and then break away once in international waters, the discovery of the missing officer forced Sablin to act. Fearing that they would be imminently discovered, Sablin ordered the ship to set sail under the cover of darkness, and within minutes the 3,500-ton ship had slipped out of port. As the ship reached the mouth of the Daugava River at 3 a.m., another sailor who was secretly opposed to the mutiny jumped overboard. Swimming to the far shore in icy cold water, the sailor managed to pull himself up onto the beach and run to a nearby road. There he tried to flag down passing cars, but none of them stopped, assuming yet another drunken sailor who had over-celebrated the holiday. Finally making his way to a public phone, the sailor called the duty officer at the Bulgaria Naval Base in Riga and informed him that he had something very important to say, but he could not do it over an unsecure line. The sailor requested a car be sent immediately to pick him up, but the officer on the other end of the line feared yet another drunken sailor pulling a prank and thus refused. The sailor then had to walk back to the naval headquarters on foot, giving the Starosavoy a 2-hour head start. Even when the sailor arrived to report in person, however, he was greeted with disbelief. Skeptical officers attempted to contact the Starosavoy via radio but received no response. Rear Admiral I.I. Varenkin, commander of the Rigar Naval Station, was also skeptical of the claims of mutiny, and no contact with Moscow was made until another sailor aboard the Starosavoy sent out a message on the emergency frequency saying mutiny on board the Starosavoy. We are heading for open sea. The message sent the Soviet Naval Command into chaos, with senior officers trying to ascertain the veracity of the message and draw up contingency plans for the recovery of the vessel. Every minute they wasted, the ship inched closer to international waters and to certain international embarrassment for the Soviet Union. The message, meanwhile, had been detected by the Swedish armed forces, as it had been broadcasted uncoded and in clear Russian, which prompted the Swedes to alert their own forces and closely monitor the situation. Fearing that the Starosevoy was intending to defect to the west, 2 recon aircraft were immediately launched from the outskirts of Riga, along with 9 other surface ships who gave chase. Yet the Starosevoy was sailing with its radar turned off, which made it very difficult to locate but put it at risk of collision with another ship in the icy fogs of the Baltic Sea. As the ship got to within a few dozen miles of Soviet territorial waters, the decision was made to turn the radar on for safety. These waters were heavily trafficked by civilian vessels, and a collision would be disastrous. The decision to turn on the radar, though, immediately alerted Soviet aircraft to the ship's location, and with the ship only 12 miles from international water, several Soviet bombers and fighter bombers bore down on it. Flying low and slow, the aircraft ordered the ship to lie dead in the water and promised that the crew would not be punished and their crimes pardoned if they reversed course and set sail back to the Soviet Union. After it was clear that the crew was not going to change course, Soviet command gave the order to attack the ship. Better to lose a state-of-the-art destroyer and its crew than to risk international embarrassment and the possible transfer of sensitive technology to the West. Yet even with an order to attack the ship, some of the planes refused to do so, their pilots refusing to attack fellow comrades. Eventually, the planes carried out their orders save for one, whose crew turned around and returned to base, its bomb load unspent. For the planes that attacked, at first they fired shots with their heavy cannons across the bow of the ship as a warning, and the bombs were dropped in a circle around the vessel, the pilots trying to avoid damaging the ship or injuring the crew. Despite being armed with very modern anti-air defenses, Sablin gave an order that the crew were not to fire on the aircraft attacking them, as he would broach no violence against his fellow servicemen in the name of their revolution. Soviet forces, meanwhile, were in full disarray, all being carefully monitored and recorded by Swedish radio and radar operators. By now, the rest of the fleet had caught up with the Starosevoy, and the lead ship of the pursuing forces was mistaken as the Starosevoy by one of the attack aircraft, which attacked it with cannon and rocket fire. This ship would end up suffering more damage than the Starosevoy and would have to limp back home for repairs. On board the Starosevoy, though, the rudder had been damaged, which made steering the ship difficult. With aircraft raking the ship with rockets and cannon fire, the conspirators began to lose heart, and gradually the ranks of the mutineers shrank. Eventually, Sablin agreed to surrender the ship, wishing no more violence to befall the men he had led in a bid to ignite the spark of revolution. At 0800 hours, the ship was boarded by the Soviet Marines, though control had already been restored to the formerly imprisoned captain. For his role in leading the mutiny, Sablin was court-martialed in June of 1976 and found guilty, then summarily executed on the 3rd of August 1976. His second-in-command during the mutiny, Alexander Schein, received an 8-year prison sentence to be served in one of the Soviet Union's infamous gulags. The rest of the crew, who had feared certain imprisonment, were released from military service, Soviet authorities fearing that a mass incarceration would spread the story of the mutiny far and wide and possibly incite other mutinies across the military. Instead, each sailor was strictly warned to never speak of the incident again and sent home, their service in the military over. The Swiss, meanwhile, kept the secret of the Starosevoy's mutiny for decades, initially fearful that the incoming ships and aircraft may have been the opening moves of a new world war. The ensuing drama was deemed potentially damaging to Swiss-Soviet relations, and thus all radio and radar records of the mutiny were classified secret. For decades, the world would know nothing about the attempted mutiny, and though Sablin's revolution may have failed before it ever began, the Soviet Union would collapse just 2 decades later. It was a moment in time that almost ended it all for the human race, the ultimate game of brinksmanship. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1962, Cuba. The Soviet Union has been welcomed with open arms by the Fidel Castro regime. Seen as a guarantor of Cuban independence from the United States, the Cuban-Soviet alliance is vital for Castro and a strategic coup for the Soviet Union. With Miami only 80 miles away, Cuba gives the Soviets air bases and naval facilities from which to do something no foreign power has been able to do in over 150 years, threaten the American homeland. But Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, has not taken full advantage of the strategic importance offered by Cuba. Much to Castro's chagrin, Khrushchev knows 2 things. First, the Soviet Navy is unlikely to be able to support Soviet forces so far from their own shores if facing down the American Navy. And second, the presence of large Soviet military forces 80 miles from the US would be an extreme provocation that's unlikely to remain unanswered. This is why it comes as such a surprise to many senior Soviet leaders when Khrushchev approves a plan to station nuclear weapons in Cuba. If military forces would be a provocation, this is tantamount to a declaration of war. The plan must be carried out in complete secrecy. Khrushchev's goal is to set up several dozen nuclear-capable missiles on Cuba and then reveal their existence to American President John F. Kennedy. He'll use the presence of the missiles as leverage to gain several concessions from the U.S. in return, chiefly the removal of American nuclear missiles in Turkey and possibly even the evacuation of West Berlin by NATO forces. If Khrushchev can catch Kennedy by surprise, Kennedy will have no choice but to agree to the demands or face down the threat of nuclear missiles capable of reaching Washington in 10 minutes or less. But American intelligence has kept an expansive spy ring alive and well in Cuba. Many Cuban citizens may not have liked the Batista dictatorship supported by the U.S., but they like Castro and communism even less. Rumors circulate about a large influx of Soviet military personnel disguised as agriculture experts and civil engineers. Movement of Soviet equipment across the island has been spotted and reported to American field agents, who relay the information back to their handlers on the mainland. The intelligence community is convinced there are Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, but nobody else believes them. They must gather evidence. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane is piloted by Major Richard Heiser and takes off from an airfield in Florida and heads for Cuba. Flying at extreme heights, the plane is difficult to target with ground-based weapons, and Cuban radar operators aren't as alert as they should be. The plane takes thousands of photographs of suspected Soviet military sites on the island before returning home. The film roll, over 3 miles in length, is rushed to be analyzed by intelligence specialists. The specialists have been cooperating with experts in Soviet nuclear missile sites, and with their knowledge confirm the presence of several sites on Cuba which look exactly like known nuclear sites in the USSR. The greatest existential threat the United States has ever faced has just been confirmed. As the news is rushed to President Kennedy, the Soviets continue their work. They cover their launchers with camouflage netting during the day and work strictly at night to avoid detection. Khrushchev monitors their progress carefully. If the missiles can remain undetected in just over a week, they'll be active, and he'll have achieved the greatest strategic victory in Russian history. October 16th, President John F. Kennedy has called an immediate meeting of XCOM, a team of his most senior advisors and Pentagon officials. The photos are analyzed and scrutinized. American intelligence confirms the locations of the missiles brought to Cuba aboard Soviet freighters and carefully hidden from public view during the transit. Kennedy asks just how long it'll take for the missiles to be active. Estimates vary, but most agree it'll take just over a week. The president needs options, and he needs them fast. Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, the legendary World War II Bulldog bomber commander, has an immediate answer. "Bomb the sumbitches," he responds. The United States has the largest strategic bomber fleet in the world, and LeMay's Air Force can level the missile sites in a matter of hours. The other military advisors in the room agree with LeMay, strongly favoring immediate military action. The U.S. Marines, supported by the Navy and Army, can have a foothold in Cuba with just a few days prep time. The missiles, Castro, and the Soviets could all be out of the Western Hemisphere by the end of the week. Kennedy's non-military advisors are horrified, and Kennedy shares their objections. A military strike would kill thousands of Soviet personnel and risk escalating the conflict. Khrushchev would be likely to take retaliatory action in Germany, particularly against West Berlin, where 15,000 NATO forces are surrounded by over 100,000 Eastern Bloc forces. The heated argument lasts for hours, and finally Kennedy is given 3 options: an air attack and possible invasion of Cuba, diplomacy with Castro and Khrushchev, or a naval quarantine of the island. Kennedy immediately takes to the quarantine idea, though is careful to phrase it as a quarantine and not a blockade that would technically be considered an act of war. However, Kennedy needs more time to prepare the U.S. Navy and to consider how to execute the quarantine. Soviet ships frequently travel to the island nation, and he needs to mull the decision over. He knows the Soviets may call his bluff, and American seamen may be forced to fire on Soviet ships with unknown repercussions. To the rest of the world, the American government seems to be pursuing business as usual. Soviet intelligence is confident that the U.S. still doesn't know about the missiles. Congressional elections are coming up shortly, and Kennedy goes on the campaign trail for fellow Democrats, acting as if everything is perfectly fine. Behind the scenes, though, the U.S. military is preparing for conflict. America's silent service, its fleet of submarines, begin a hunt for Soviet ballistic missile subs and then shadow them. In the case of war, they'll be sunk before having a chance to fire. American journalists, however, are beginning to grow suspicious. Leaks from within the White House have led to rumors of imminent military action against Cuba. The rumors, completely unsubstantiated, then begin to hint at the presence of nuclear weapons on the island. A Washington correspondent spots a dinner meeting of senior military leadership and Cuban policy experts and presses for answers, but the men refuse to answer. One major editorial finally has enough evidence to go to press with a bombshell story about Soviet weapons in Cuba, and President Kennedy himself personally asks the editor of the paper to not publish the story. The editor agrees, giving Kennedy more time to prepare his response. Kennedy leaves the campaign trail in order to meet with senior advisors, and at a daily press briefing, reporters demand to know if rumors that the president returned to Washington to discuss a military matter of great significance are true. The White House press secretary assures the reporters that the president was simply suffering from a worsening cold. The Soviets, however, are growing suspicious that their weapons have been made by the Americans. Their fears are confirmed when, on the morning of October 22nd, the White House press secretary announces that the president will address all Americans on a matter of vital national importance that very evening. As the sun sets across America, President John F. Kennedy addresses the United States and the world over television and radio. The president confirms the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons on Cuba, as well as the assembling of Soviet strategic bombers and the creation of support airfields. He lambasts the Soviet Union for lying about the defensive nature of the military buildup on the island. Kennedy then announces a naval quarantine of the island, stating that any ships discovered to be carrying weapons will be turned back, and the quarantine will be strictly enforced. He also makes it clear that any nuclear weapons launched against any target in the Western Hemisphere will be considered an act of war against the United States itself. Thousands of miles away, Khrushchev and his cabinet pay close attention to Kennedy's speech. Khrushchev is actually greatly relieved. He had expected and had been preparing for military action. However, Kennedy's quarantine is a clear signal that he's willing to negotiate. That night, Khrushchev sends his own signal to Washington by attending the opera where an American performer is currently headlining. He meets with the American and together they discuss peace. But the fate of the world may be out of the hands of the two men whose militaries are preparing to go to war against each other and in the hands of those very soldiers. Back in the US, the American Navy is steaming into position around Cuba and closing the cordon. With 20 ships already on their way from the Soviet Union, tensions are sky high. Standing orders are to issue radio warnings to turn back. If any ship refuses, a single warning shot across the bow will be fired. If the ship still refuses to turn back, American ships are authorized to fire in order to disable the ship. Still, several hundred miles out, the Soviet ships, however, are not showing any signs of stopping or turning around, further ratcheting tensions. The American secret SOSUS underwater surveillance program confirms the presence of Soviet submarines moving into the Caribbean. Back in Washington, an American reporter is getting a drink at a bar and chatting with a friend. He remarks that he's soon to be attached to a Marine landing force. The bartender overhears the chatter and moves down the bar to where a Soviet reporter is drinking. The bartender taunts the Soviet, telling him that soon the US will be invading Cuba. The Soviet is not just a prominent reporter, though, he's a KGB agent. The next day, the Soviet ambassador meets with the American reporter and over dinner attempts to pump him for information about a possible invasion of Cuba. The reporter simply warns the ambassador not to underestimate the resolve of the US. October 25th, the Eastern Caribbean. Soviet freighters full of arms are approaching the quarantine zone. They've ignored all warnings to turn back. American ships sound battle stations, but at the last minute the ships suddenly change course and sail back for Europe. The oil tanker Bucharest, however, refuses to turn back. American captains are under orders not to fire without express authorization from the president himself. Kennedy is informed of the tanker's refusal. His advisors warn him that if they allow the tanker through, it'll only encourage other Soviet ships to break the quarantine as well. Kennedy decides to risk it and allows the tanker to dock in Cuba. The next day, Fidel Castro sends a letter to Khrushchev imploring him to launch a nuclear first strike against the US. He's willing to sacrifice his island and his people for the cause of global revolution if it means the US will also burn in flames. Khrushchev ignores the letter and writes one of his own to Kennedy, penning a strong emotional appeal for both sides to find a peaceful resolution and not doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. Kennedy receives the letter and considers it. It poses great political risk for both sides. If the letter is leaked, Khrushchev could appear weak to the Soviet people and his allies. If Kennedy takes the letter at face value and it turns out to be nothing more than a manipulative ploy, Kennedy could appear extremely naive. Back in Cuba, the Americans are now keeping tabs on the progress of the missile buildup with the use of U-2 spy planes. The planes are detected by Cuban radar, but the anti-air missiles are under the command of Soviet units. Soviet forces are under strict orders not to fire without Kremlin authorization. October 27th. High in the sky over Cuba, an American U-2 is flying a reconnaissance mission. Major Rudolph Anderson has been detected and tracked by Cuban radar. Soviet missiles have a good lock on the American plane. Inexplicably, the Soviet ground commander gives the order to fire. A telephone pole-sized missile streaks up to the sky. In minutes, it explodes under the belly of the U-2, tearing it into pieces. Shrapnel from the explosion rips through the cockpit, fatally wounding Major Anderson. The first shot of World War III may have just been fired. Unknown to the Soviets, the White House had already decided even before the U-2 took flight that if it was shot down, they wouldn't even meet. a military response would be immediately launched. What the Americans don't know, however, is that Soviet strategic nuclear weapons are already operational and more than capable of annihilating an American invasion force. Luckily for the world, the White House goes back on their original plan and decides to meet and discuss the incident instead of launching a military strike. As the Americans debate their response, however, yet another provocation is about to launch global thermonuclear war. Soviet submarines have been tracked by the Americans across the Caribbean, and now one has been detected loitering near the quarantine zone. Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-59 has been running deep and silent in order to avoid the American Navy, but its batteries are nearly exhausted. It's now loitering on the surface and running its diesel engines in order to recharge onboard batteries when the crew spot two American destroyers streaming directly at them. The captain calls for an emergency crash dive, and the sub gets under the waves just a minute before the Americans arrive. The two destroyers begin dropping practice depth charges around the submarine's location. These charges are used in training and contain little explosive charge and are meant to signal to the submarine that it must surface. However, the Soviet crew don't know that the US is dropping training charges, and to make matters worse, they've been out of radio contact with Moscow for days due to their need to run deep and silent. When they surfaced, they'd been monitoring US civilian radio for signs of how the crisis was playing out. The submarines fear that the war has already broken out. Unknown to the Americans above, the B-59 is equipped with a nuclear-tipped torpedo, and believing that they're under attack and war had broken out, Captain Valentin Savitsky and political officer Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov both approve launch of the nuclear torpedo. However, Vasily Arkhipov, commander of the submarine flotilla B-59 is a part of, does not give his consent. On any other Soviet submarine, only two officers must give consent, but with Arkhipov aboard, all three must agree. The launch is aborted, and the B-59 surfaces to re-establish contact with Moscow. Nuclear war is once more just barely avoided. On October 28th, Khrushchev concedes to Kennedy's demands that the missiles be withdrawn. The American ambassador has already informed him that American missiles in Turkey were going to be removed anyway, but the plan couldn't be made public. Kennedy and Khrushchev have come to an agreement. The missiles in Cuba will be removed, and America will remove its own missiles from Turkey. The apparent concession by the US gives Khrushchev just enough to save face in front of the Politburo. But there still doesn't exist a direct line between Moscow and Washington, and sending a telegraph could take hours. Meanwhile, US and Soviet forces are still playing an extremely dangerous cat-and-mouse game under the Caribbean. Any minute now, yet another trigger-happy soldier could inadvertently launch the end of the world. Khrushchev orders that news of his agreement be broadcast over public radio, as that will be the fastest way to get words to the Americans and immediately stand down all forces. An official staff vehicle speeds across Moscow to reach a broadcast center before another accident triggers war. All traffic lights on the route are switched to green as the car roars through the streets, finally arriving at its destination. However, on the elevator ride up to the broadcast booth, the elevator becomes stuck. To the horror of the Kremlin staffer clutching Khrushchev's letter to Kennedy, the elevator may take hours to be repaired. In despair, he manages to force the letter through a gap in the elevator doors and into the hands of a messenger boy who holds the very fate of the world in his hands. The message is at last successfully broadcast and picked up by radios all across the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis is officially over, and the US closely monitors the removal of Soviet weapons from Cuba. 8 months later, as promised, US missiles are removed from Turkey. Against all odds, the world has narrowly avoided nuclear catastrophe. The date is November 2nd, 2021. The world economy has at last begun to recover from the coronavirus outbreak. But as nations begin to open up again, one country is determined to reshape the New World Order in its own image. For 3 weeks, China has been building its forces for a cross-strait invasion into Taiwan. Given its still limited mobility fleet and extreme currents of the Strait of Taiwan, China has a very narrow window to secure a beachhead only twice a year, and the Chinese Communist Party is no longer willing to wait for peaceful reunification. In response to the military buildup, the United States has responded in kind, moving a sizable portion of its Atlantic fleet to the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Bases in Hawaii, Australia, Alaska, and Japan all bustle with activity, as thousands of aircraft are shuttled to airfields closer to the potential conflict zone. Guam, linchpin of the U.S. operations in South Pacific, is on full alert. At 0124 hours, China launches the first salvo of World War III. Overhead, American spy satellites pick up the unmistakable thermal plumes of hundreds of ballistic missiles lifting off launch vehicles and silos all across eastern China. Much of these missiles smash into neighboring Taiwan, but a number of them reach space and then readjust their trajectories. Guided by Chinese satellites and ground control stations, Chinese DF-26 ballistic missiles, otherwise known as Guam killers, perform course correction burns before re-entering the atmosphere, packing a warhead loaded with over 3,000 pounds of explosives. Each missile is a deadly threat to a target on the ground. American Aegis cruisers immediately launch volleys of ballistic missile interceptors, seeking to destroy the Chinese missiles while still outside the atmosphere. American THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Units stationed in both South Korea and Guam, send their own volleys of interceptors. But the DF-26 missiles carry countermeasures and scatter radar-confusing chaff and decoys as they cruise just outside of the atmosphere and prepare to enter their terminal phase. American interceptors destroy many missiles, but many more slip past the first layer of defense. Now entering the atmosphere, Patriot missile defense batteries stationed on Guam fire interceptors in droves. More missiles are killed, but just half a minute later, over a dozen DF-26 missiles prepare for impact. 4 of the missiles split open, showering American runways with runway cratering munitions. The rest smash into important fuel and munition storage facilities or strike at barracks and plane hangars. The DF-26 missiles aren't exactly precise. They have a target radius of just under 100 meters, but with over 3,000 pounds of explosives, they don't need to be. In seconds, Guam is a smoking ruin, and a significant portion of U.S. Pacific military might has just been neutralized. Out at sea, however, the DF-26 targeting American carrier strike groups don't fare as well. If China is going to have any chance of winning the war, the American carriers need to be destroyed and have been secondary in priority only to Guam. The American carriers have been sailing at full steam, though, and performing erratic maneuvers. The 2 powerful nuclear reactors aboard the Nimitz carriers pushed the massive ships to top speeds that have to this day remained classified, easily outrunning their escorts, but for their erratic maneuvers meant to throw off the D-26's targeting. The strike group's defenses open up on the big missiles, with its accompanying cruisers firing off volley after volley of interceptors. Most of the DF-26s are downed, but a near miss cripples the Ronald Reagan and forces it to return to the American West Coast for extensive repairs. A direct hit on the bow of the Abraham Lincoln devastates the massive carrier. Within 2 hours, the giant ship and its accompanying 80 combat aircraft and thousands of sailors are all lying at the bottom of the sea. The U.S. has just suffered more casualties in the first 3 hours of World War III than in 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, it's America's turn to strike back. Chinese missile strikes have devastated American and allied nation bases across the Pacific, from Guam to Japan, and as far south as Australia. America's first counterattack doesn't come from a kinetic weapon, but from an electronic one. Malicious code lurking in Chinese computer systems for years comes to life with a single keystroke, and suddenly Chinese communications and intelligence networks are brought to a screeching halt. China is shocked at the electronic devastation of the attack and at the lackluster performance of what it had hoped would be a digital Pearl Harbor against the US. Chinese government hackers are only just now discovering that the computer systems they've been painstakingly penetrating over the course of years have largely been simulated. Anticipating a massive cyber attack in the case of war, the US has spoofed many of its own critical military computer networks and allowed foreign powers to believe their software was penetrating real networks being used by real people. These fake networks are so detailed that they even simulate individual workers' browsing history. Chinese hackers can watch as personnel waste time on YouTube and playing their favorite flash games, yet it's all fake, simulated by AI. But the electronic attack is quickly followed by a very real kinetic attack. On the long-range radar, Chinese air defense installations watch American B-2 bombers on approach. The stealthy planes can't evade radar completely, and intermittent contacts betray their presence while still hundreds of miles from the Chinese coast. However, knowing the stealth bombers are somewhere out there and getting a target lock is a totally different thing, and high-frequency targeting radars can't resolve a good lock on the incredibly stealthy bombers. Featuring upgraded stealth composites and an exhaust system that cools the hot air of the twin turbojets powering the big bombers, the B-2s penetrate even deeper toward Chinese territory. Fighter jets are scrambled to intercept the attack craft, but while still hundreds of miles away, the B-2s let loose with their payloads. Each B-2 briefly flashes brightly on the radar as its cargo bay doors are opened and then quickly closed, restoring its stealth characteristics. Then, the big planes turn around and head for surviving friendly airfields. From the belly of each plane, half a dozen large missiles fall toward the Pacific Ocean. Rocket engines come to life as the missiles fall to just a few hundred feet off the waves, and each missile levels off at just over 50 feet over the breaking waves. The missiles feature stealthy characteristics, making them very difficult to track and target with interceptors, and terrain-following radar allows them to skim just above the waves so as to remain under the horizon of Chinese radar. As the missiles accelerate to twice the speed of sound, the rocket engines suddenly cut off and are jettisoned, and the missile's main mode of propulsion, a scramjet, flares to life. The scramjet has no moving parts and works by compressing incoming air from the nose of the missile and injecting fuel into the superheated air, which instantly ignites. However, each missile has to be helped along to supersonic speed before the scramjets can engage. But once they do, the missiles punch forward until they're moving at thousands of miles an hour. The missiles arrive at their targets across the Chinese coast. They roar over population centers to reach military buildup zones, air bases, and command and control nodes. Upon reaching their targets, the missiles suddenly plunge to the ground, causing only minor destruction on impact. However, for miles around each missile's final descent, all electronics have been permanently disabled. The US has just crippled thousands of Chinese vehicles, command and control nodes, ships, aircraft, and computers with electromagnetic pulse weapons. Not a single Chinese soldier has died in the attack, but immeasurable damage has been done to Chinese logistics and military infrastructure. A few days later, the surface war to push the US out of the Pacific has finally began in earnest. Chinese Type 055 and 052 destroyers are punching well above their weight class against American ships. The Chinese destroyers are newer than their American counterparts, many of which have begun to show their age. The Type 55 and 52s are fast, precise, and lethal with their arsenal of anti-ship cruise missiles and inflict heavy losses on American ships. They're supported by a range of bases built across the South China Sea, each one of which is home to dozens of missile batteries, combat aircraft, and long-range surveillance radar. Despite its carrier strike groups largely intact, the US can't penetrate the outer ring of Chinese Pacific defenses without a dedicated concentration of firepower. Until the South China Sea artificial reef bases are neutralized, it'll be weeks before the US Navy can bring the fight to China's shores. In the meantime, speedy and agile Chinese destroyers seek out US and allied ships that stray too close, supported by aircraft flying out of the reclaimed island bases China has spent 2 decades building, while the world just watched. Under the waves, however, the United States has let loose its fleet of terrifying underwater predators. American attack submarines have been more prepared for this fight than the rest of the US Navy, pre-positioned along critical waterways for months at a time thanks to their nuclear reactors, which provide them with unlimited endurance. It's only the crew's need to eat that limits the sub's endurance, but a whole fleet of fast resupply vessels keeps America's silent service well supplied at war, and the deadly subs back on target. American Virginia and Los Angeles class submarines have begun hunting Chinese subs since the war began. By far, their most difficult prey is the stealthy Type 39A, a submarine so advanced it caught US intelligence completely by surprise. The advantage, however, remains firmly on the US side, as China's anti-submarine warfare capabilities continue to lag significantly behind the US. Lacking air and surface assets to hunt down American subs, the quiet nuclear-powered subs methodically search for the Chinese diesel-electric subs. After losing 3 subs to the American fleet, the Chinese have ordered their own subs close to support bases. The Chinese subs' main mission, after all, is to attack American surface ships, and they're still being kept at bay by the massive People's Liberation Army rocket force. However, this leaves the US Silent Service free to hunt across the South Pacific, and dozens of Chinese ships are either sunk or crippled in attacks. Some American subs are lost, but the Virginia-class subs prove even more difficult to locate and sink than Los Angeles-class, featuring a new generation of noise-canceling rubber tiles and equipment built with tolerances tighter than even spacecraft. The Virginia-class submarines are deadly predators and send many People's Liberation Army Navy ships to the bottom of the ocean. The war, however, remains at an impasse at the moment. Until China's South China Sea bases can be neutralized, the US can't bring its own considerable naval and air power to bear, let alone begin the reconquest and liberation of Taiwan. What has become extremely clear to both sides, however, is that the most important weapons of what will become World War III are for the first time in history exclusively weapons that operate in the cyber, space, and naval warfighting realms. Despite conflicts such as the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the second U.S. invasion of Iraq, the world has enjoyed relative peace and quiet for almost 80 years. While these and other conflicts may seem like anything but peaceful, the truth is that the long and almost unbroken chain of major wars between large powers was at last broken by the end of World War II. Yet as we swing into the new year, the likelihood of another world war only grows by the day. Here are the places that World War III could actually break out in the new year. Turkey. Turkey has been a steadfast ally of NATO for decades, and yet in recent years that commitment to the alliance has wavered significantly. Ongoing tensions between Greece and Turkey, both NATO members, have put severe strain on the alliance, with Turkey claiming islands in the Mediterranean which belong to Greece. While violence has so far been avoided, numerous airborne interceptions of Turkish fighters by the Greek Air Force have taken place, and just this last summer, the situation reached a boiling point. In defiance of Greek maritime claims, Turkey dispatched a small force of warships along with a survey vessel exploring for oil and gas reserves. As the survey ship was followed by both Greek and Turkish vessels, a collision between a Greek and Turkish ship nearly led to shots being fired. As the two nations continue to clash politically over massive oil and gas reserves of the island of Cyprus, a confrontation only grows more likely. For its part, the U.S., long the bulwark of the NATO alliance, has decided to remain silent on the issue, as President Trump decided the issue was best handled by the EU. So what could happen in the future to spark a world war? Turkey and the U.S.'s own relationship is already severely strained after Trump gave Turkey's Erdogan the green light to attack U.S.-backed Kurds in one of the greatest betrayals in history. After massive backlash from the American public in the U.S. Senate, Trump pulled an about-face and threatened to level massive sanctions against Turkey. This, in turn, drew threats from President Erdogan, who has publicly stated ambitions to possibly seize large stockpiles of American nuclear weapons currently stored at Incirlik Air Force Base inside of Turkey. Should Turkey make a move on the American weapons stored at Incirlik Air Force Base, it would completely overwhelm local American forces and get its hands on a sizable nuclear stockpile. The U.S. would have no option but to respond with full military force. This could potentially lead to a splintering of NATO and possibly the end of the alliance itself. With President Trump giving the cold shoulder to Turkey, the nation is drawn much closer to Russia, and if Putin believes that the U.S. may not have the backing of other European powers, could potentially join the conflict and kick the U.S. out of Europe for good. Iran-Israel. Over the last several months, several Arab nations have formally announced diplomatic ties with Israel, a massive step forward for Middle East peace. Perhaps the most significant step forward, however, might have been the United Arab Emirates' normalization of ties with Israel. However, not every neighbor is growing chummy with Israel, and Iran has pushed back hard on recent developments. Currently, Iran continues to finance, train, and sometimes even directly lead anti-Israel militias and terrorist groups across the region, while Israel has been openly striking at Iranian military targets outside of Iran itself. While Israel slowly builds an anti-Iran coalition across the Middle East, Iran has responded by engaging with various terror groups and militias. Iran's increasing isolation only makes the country more dangerous. Should Iran decide it's in danger of being encircled by pro-Israel states, it might decide to strike preemptively either directly at Israel or at a neighbor such as Saudi Arabia. This would likely come as an unconventional attack using terrorist forces and serve as a warning that nations should continue to distance themselves from Israel or else. Israel might feel it has no choice but to respond or see its diplomatic efforts evaporate, leading to strikes inside Iran itself. With President Trump's ill-advised cancellation of the Iranian nuclear deal, the nation may once more pursue nuclear weapons. While the Iran nuclear deal made it nearly impossible for Iran to build nuclear weapons covertly, now the nation has much more breathing room to do so, and should Israel feel that Iran is nearing the bomb, it might be forced to attack first. This would doubtlessly lead to a catastrophic war which would threaten major parts of the world's oil supply, inevitably drawing both the US and Russia. Kashmir. Ever since the creation of the Indian and Pakistani states, the two have butted heads over the region known as Kashmir. Things only took a turn for the worse when China seized part of Kashmir during the Indo-Chinese Border War of 1962. To date, India and Pakistan have waged 3 wars over Kashmir, along with a variety of other issues that still sees the two countries holding on to very long-running grudges. In recent years, China has grown much closer to Pakistan, much to the chagrin of India, who, for its part, has chosen to develop closer ties to the United States. The situation has become a tinderbox that's ready to go up at any moment. And with both India and Pakistan having ties to the two most powerful nations in the world, a war between the two would indubitably pull in both China and the US. In 2020, it seemed war between China and India was all but inevitable. Starting in early summer 2020, China began a series of incremental crawls, pushing troops forward slowly to inevitably seize control of large swaths of territory. This led to fistfights between Indian and Chinese troops, with one at Pangong So causing 72 injuries on the Indian side and an unknown amount of the Chinese side. China then began to build helipads, pillboxes, and fortified bunkers while reinforcing their troops already present. In a bid to prevent an all-out escalation to war, both sides have agreed to only use firearms if fired on first. However, this has led to a bizarre throwback to medieval times as both sides now carry all manner of improvised weapons, such as clubs, rods, batons, and other melee weapons. On June 15th, a massive 600-man skirmish between both sides led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers, though U.S. intelligence states that 35 Chinese soldiers were killed or seriously injured. The incident directly led to the removal of restrictions on the Indian side on the usage of firearms, and another such skirmish might now be met with lethal force, hopelessly escalating the fighting into all-out war. If India were to fight itself in a fight with China, Pakistan would almost certainly see this as an opportunity to attack and India forced to fight a two-front war. Even without the intervention of the United States, which would surely back India, this would already be a conflict between three nuclear powers, with the outcome not looking good for the world. Korean Peninsula. Despite an optimistic two meetings between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, the historic talks between the two countries inevitably broke down over the issue of nuclear disarmament. For North Korea, disarmament is a non-starter, as the Kim regime believes nuclear weapons is the only way to guarantee the U.S. does not oust it from power as it's done in other nations such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. North Korea sees nuclear weapons as the only guarantor of its continued independence against the U.S. and an international coalition of its allies. On a personal level, Kim Jong-un is himself dependent on nuclear weapons for his own political survival. After failing to deliver for years on a working nuclear weapon, the Kim family's hold on power was seriously threatened during the transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. What might have been a moment of temporary weakness, however, was turned into strength as Kim Jong-un immediately initiated a ruthless purging of senior military and political leadership that he saw as a threat to his power. Yet, despite his success in developing nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un still faces a dicey political environment. As North Korea slowly grows and expands, many of the North Korean elite grow tired of the extreme financial burden international sanctions have placed on them. Incredibly, President Trump may have himself inadvertently helped Kim Jong-un remain in power, though. Despite the objection of every single advisor, the Department of Defense, and the most senior Democratic and Republican leadership, President Trump agreed to meet face-to-face with Kim Jong-un. What he may have seen as a potential diplomatic victory, however, only helped to cement Kim Jong-un's hold on power, as his ministers spun the event into state propaganda showing that at long last, Kim Jong-un had forced the world's only superpower to bend the knee and meet to discuss terms of peace. Now that the Kim family is sure to remain in power and yet refuses to dismantle its nuclear program, a confrontation between the US and North Korea grows ever more likely. Japan, who has for a long time been forced to suffer North Korean missile tests flying directly overhead, may force the US's hand if it decides North Korea presents an imminent threat and launches preemptive strikes against nuclear facilities and missile silos. A conflict between the US and North Korea would inevitably see China dragged into the mix to defend its longtime ally, as the one thing that China fears most is a unified Korean peninsula that's led by South Korea and very pro-US. This would be a strategic disaster for China and one that it cannot abide, leaving it no choice but to join a war against the US. Taiwan. Finally, we reach the most likely flashpoint for World War III. The issue of Taiwan has plagued Chinese-American relations for decades, but in recent years has escalated to a level reminiscent of the 1999 Taiwan Strait crisis. Shortly before taking office, President Trump received a call from Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, congratulating him on his election. This greatly angered China, which has threatened war should any nation formally recognize Taiwan as independent, and was seen as a major snub to the Chinese Communist Party. Historically, American presidents have not taken such congratulatory calls in order to not anger Beijing and potentially destabilize cross-strait relations between China and Taiwan. Things quickly escalated as Taiwan and the U.S. negotiated a multi-billion-dollar arms sales deal that would see the Taiwanese military receive weapon systems and upgrades that would pose a significant threat to a Chinese invasion on the island. Tensions were heightened when, despite massive Chinese interference in its elections, Taiwan re-elected President Tsai Ing-wen, who holds a staunch anti-reunification agenda. Taiwan's support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong during the months-long riots only further embarrassed the Chinese mainland, as President Xi Jinping remained unable to enforce control over the region. Today, the U.S. is contemplating stationing American Marines in Taiwan on a rotational basis, along with port visits by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. also okayed the construction of a massive computer chip manufacturing plant in Arizona owned and operated by a Taiwanese firm, while simultaneously blocking Chinese company Huawei global access to critical chip manufacturing equipment. These actions have been seen as incredibly provocative by China, who even now is rushing to bolster its long-range attack capabilities with the goal of throwing the U.S. Navy out of the South Pacific. For President Xi Jinping, the Taiwan issue is one of personal and party survival. The Chinese Communist Party has for decades promised to reunify the breakaway island nation, and yet it has failed to do so. This signals to the world an inherent weakness in the Chinese nation, and China does not believe it can be taken seriously as a global power if it can't even bring a next-door neighbor to the fold again. For growing voices of dissent within Chinese politics, Taiwan's continued independence is a sign of the weakness within the CCP, and with his future hold on the nation on the line, President Xi Jinping might be forced at last to turn to the military option to reunify Taiwan. Inevitably, this would drag the US and its allies into all-out conflict with China. The unthinkable has happened, and military forces clash on land, in the air, and on the sea, and underneath it, in the most violent war to date. But what would actually happen after World War III? The probability of a third world war is negligible but not impossible. All three of these big military powers who have the capability to launch a global war all have too much to lose by doing so. But history is full of examples of small conflicts spiraling completely out of control and beyond the plans of those who initiated them. To find out what the world would look like after World War III, we have to examine two different global wars, a conventional war and a nuclear war. One thing is for sure, the economic damage alone would reshape the face of the Earth. Such a war would inevitably begin by a confrontation between US and Chinese forces in the South or East China Sea. A Sino-US war isn't likely to go global and would require multiple escalatory steps to get there. First, China would have to directly threaten or attack Japanese forces, something that is predisposed to do already because of the presence of multiple US air bases in Japan. If China wanted to keep Japan out of the conflict, it would have to avoid striking these bases, which would have seriously detrimental effects on its ability to fight against the US. Next, a third party would have to be willing to exploit the situation to its own advantage. The most likely culprits here are India, Iran, and Russia. India would be tempted to act to push Chinese ground forces out of the contested northern border regions and perhaps even maneuver itself to throw China out of Tibet, thus threatening Chinese freshwater supplies and granting it massive leverage over its rival. That's unlikely but not impossible, as a Sino-American war would largely be fought at the sea and in the air, leaving the People's Liberation Army free to fight against Indian incursion. Iran, however, is likely to exploit the diversion of US forces from the region for its own gain. A war between the US and China would inevitably cause a drawdown of US peacekeeping forces in other regions of the world. Currently, 60% of US firepower is in the Pacific, but as losses rapidly mount, the US will need to pull reinforcements from its multiple other global commands. With American forces no longer acting as police against bad actors, Iran could use the opportunity to attack Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states with its superior military. This would hugely disrupt global oil trade and have devastating financial repercussions across the world. Russia might seek to exploit US preoccupation with China for its own gain in Europe. While Russia has no ambition to rule all of Europe, it could see a drawdown of US forces in Europe as the opportunity to take by force breakaway Soviet republics and even some of its NATO neighbors such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In a worst-case scenario, all three flashpoints are ignited due to American preoccupation with China, leaving the world dramatically different after the war. Such a war is almost certain to end with a US victory over China, although an extremely costly and poorly defined victory. Immediately at war's end, the United States military would be severely depleted, going from the world's most powerful fighting force to a significantly weakened force that still has global reach, but will take a decade or more to restore itself to its former glory. American naval and air losses would be staggering, as with much of half of its air and naval fleets destroyed. Half of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet would be sunk in a conflict with China, a loss of over $50 billion in ship costs alone, over 500 aircraft and over 12,000 seamen and aviators. The loss of all important American carriers alone would see the United States lose its ability to rapidly respond to global conflicts. This loss in capability would only be compounded by significant losses in the U.S. Air Force. Without the ability to rapidly and overwhelmingly respond to global crises, the immediate post-war years would see an ignition of regional wars across Africa and the Middle Middle East, critics of U.S. military presence around the world would rapidly see the cost of losing that peacekeeping force as simmering tensions suddenly explode in the absence of a threat of U.S. involvement. In the Middle East, Iran would seize the opportunity to attack its longtime rival Saudi Arabia. Despite being an oil-rich and wealthy nation, Saudi Arabia is handily outclassed militarily by Iran, as it has relied on the United States to keep Iran in check for decades. No other power is likely to prevent Iranian aggression in the Middle East, nor do they have the capability to do so. All European powers, save for France, simply no longer have the expeditionary capabilities to respond to military conflicts around the world without U.S. support, and France lacks the assets needed to significantly counter Iranian aggression so far from its own shores. An oil-rich Iran would become a regional superpower, shaping the Middle Eastern policy to its own liking. This would inevitably lead to an explosion of extremism, with waves of attacks against Europe and African nations, launching both continents into a dark age of terrorism. Enriched by Saudi Arabian wealth and oil fields, Iran could continue a campaign of conquest unchecked across the Middle East, forcing other neighboring nations into its fold and simply invading those that resisted. With its finger firmly on the oil tap to Europe, Iran would have great influence over European powers, likely leading to a necessary buildup of military forces in Europe and an inevitable invasion of the Middle East years later. A European Middle East war would be a world war in its own right, with staggering casualties on all sides and economically ruinous for both regions. Middle East turmoil would only make the lives of those in China worse. In the aftermath of a war against the U.S., the Chinese Navy and Air Force would be obliterated, with only those forces left in reserve in Western China against India or Russian incursions left intact. Chinese infrastructure, at least along its eastern Pacific border, would also suffer moderate damage due to American long-range air attacks, while China can do little to militarily threaten the U.S. homeland. Large-scale damage to Chinese port facilities would only exuberate the damage caused by years of American naval blockade. China relies on the Pacific for the majority of its trade, and most importantly for the import of energy resources. Despite heavy losses, the U.S. Navy could still undertake an effective blockade of Chinese trade, crippling the nation and resulting in a GDP loss of as much as 35%. China, in return, could threaten U.S. trade in the Pacific as well, but would be unable to directly threaten either the American West or East Coast, resulting in only an expected GDP loss of 10% for the U.S. But the disruption of trade in what's the world's most important trade superhighway would only result in the weakening of the East Asian economies and, to a smaller extent, the entire world. East Asian nations would be the hardest hit due to their dependence on Chinese goods. This will have a knock-on effect on European nations who import cheap goods manufactured in East Asia. The ensuing worldwide economic recession will lead to flare-ups in social unrest and widespread unemployment. This, combined with a worst-case scenario of Iranian aggression in the Middle East, could set the stage for revolutionary movements in some countries and the flare-up of partisan tension spilling over into outright violence. Perhaps no nation would be as rocked, though, as China, who, despite inflicting incredible losses on the U.S. military, would still be facing a humiliating defeat, with a near-total loss of its Navy and Air Force. American cyber warfare operations would work to steadily degrade the Chinese government's ability to censor information electronically throughout the nation, and increasing unrest and war weariness would embolden pro-democracy and separatist factions in China. While it's likely that the Chinese government would remain intact, this would represent a significant threat to the Chinese Communist Party, directly leading to even more violent crackdowns on an increasingly rebellious population. We've already seen this scenario in miniature thanks to the Hong Kong riots, and while China showed restraint in Hong Kong because of international pressure, it's unlikely to show restraint when faced with similar uprisings within the mainland when the survival of the CCP is threatened. The further disruption of the Chinese economy would have a domino effect on the rest of the world, especially those nations that rely on China for critical technology and imports. Global GDP would shrink significantly, leading to unemployment and unrest across the world. While the rest of the world is suffering, though, one nation might come out of a third world war smelling like roses. Russia has long suffered under a weakening economy, made worse by European sanctions due to its aggression in Crimea. However, the loss of Chinese trade routes throughout the war and a need by China to replace its destroyed military equipment would be a massive financial boon to the state. European powers might be even willing to lift sanctions against Russia and provide economic concessions or even political ones, such as allowing Russia to reabsorb former Soviet republics in exchange for the aid of the Russian military in fighting against Iranian aggression in the Middle East. A new global order after World War III would see Russia rising to a position of prominence it hasn't held since the days of the Soviet Union. But now let's look at a worst-case scenario: complete and total nuclear warfare that spans the face of the Earth. While a conventional World War III would still see the United States suffer the least militarily or economic harm, a nuclear war would almost completely level the playing field between China and the U.S., leaving both nations a ruined, smoking wreck. The U.S. still holds the advantage in number and sophistication of nuclear weapons, thus China would inevitably suffer far greater damage than the US. However, nearly every major US city would suffer at least one nuclear strike, with most coming under fire from multiple warheads. Should Russia join the fray, it would inevitably pull in nuclear NATO members such as France and Great Britain, and spread thermonuclear warfare across 4 of the world's 7 continents. Previous fears of nuclear winter have since been proven to be overblown, but a global cooling effect will still take place, dropping global temperatures by a few degrees. A drop of just 1 degree centigrade in global temperatures would make Canadian wheat growing impossible, showing us just how vulnerable the global food supply really is. What farmland isn't rendered fallow by a drop in global temperatures would likely be unusable due to nuclear impacts. Both the US and Russia target each other's vast swaths of farmland as nuclear targets, with the express intent of starving each other into submission in case of nuclear war. With the US alone exporting much of the world's grain, it wouldn't just be the Americans that starve, but much of the world as well. Compound that with strikes against Russia and Chinese food-producing regions, plus contamination from other nuclear strikes, and hundreds of millions would begin to starve within weeks. The initial casualties would also be in the hundreds of millions, with hundreds of millions more falling prey to injuries and radiation sickness within days to weeks. Then, secondary effects of global nuclear war would lead to even more deaths, as trade routes are disrupted, infrastructure is rendered inoperable, and diseases caused by high concentration of airborne debris strike down people by the millions. Many nations around the world would rely on imports to feed their populations, and the loss of global trade alone would doom tens of millions to immediate starvation. As massive plumes of choking dust and debris spread across countrysides in Australia, North America, Europe, and Asia, respiratory disease would claim millions more. Global firestorms would decimate wildlands, as fires ignited by burning cities spread for hundreds of miles around, causing fires so fast that they'd be visible from space, if not for all the debris in the atmosphere. If one could peer through that thick haze of gray that would remain aloft for days or even weeks, they would see a planet in flames, with fires raging for weeks or even months and killing millions more. The world population would likely fall to below 1 billion within 5 years of global thermonuclear war. Within a decade of starvation, disease, and conflict for dwindling resources, humanity would be lucky to number in the 500 millions. However, there is good reason to think that humanity would not go extinct after all, and could even bounce back in time. Most nuclear strikes are designed to maximize destruction. A ground burst of nuclear weapon severity limits its destructive range, as most of the energy in the explosion is sent down into the ground or absorbed by ground features such as buildings, hills, etc. Therefore, nuclear weapons are designed to explode over their target, greatly enhancing their lethality and avoiding ground clutter altogether. While this makes nuclear weapons more lethal, it has the positive side effect of sending more of the resulting radiation upwards and into space. Fears of a global irradiated wasteland might be overblown, and while it's certain that radioactive debris would be in harmful levels just about anywhere on Earth, humanity and the livestock and food crops it depends on could still survive in sufficient numbers to eventually bounce back. That's because the fissile material in a bomb is destroyed in milliseconds, causing an intense burst of radioactivity that quickly falls off as atoms decay in a chain reaction. In several years, most radioactive fallout would turn into more stable elements, such as strontium-90. With its half-life of 29 years, strontium-90 and similar materials are still harmful, but not nearly as radioactive as materials with a half-life of hours, minutes, or even seconds. As Nagasaki and Hiroshima have proven, it doesn't take long for humanity to reclaim the ruins of cities struck by nuclear weapons. The real danger is in the sheer number of weapons employed in a global nuclear war, and thus the higher concentration of less dangerous but still harmful, longer-lived radioactive isotopes in the water and soil. Human lifespans will be shortened dramatically, and many species will go extinct due to climate change, natural ecosystems will collapse, and a staggering amount of pollution will be created by the incineration of hundreds of major cities. Even after all of that, within centuries, humanity should be well on the rebound. What shape the world would take, however, is completely unknown, though it's likely that none of the current major powers would continue to exist as cohesive states. In all likelihood, it would be Africa which would become the lotus of economic and military power, as it's least likely to be directly affected by nuclear war, and unlike the rest of the world, they'd still be able to feed most of their population, as many African states have agrarian-based economies. One thing is certain, the nations that launched World War III would not be much more than dust, and utterly inconsequential in the new era of human history to come. Now go check out US vs. China 2020 military comparison, or click this other video instead.